All right, welcome everyone and good morning. It's way too early in the morning, but everyone's welcome anyway. And if you snooze off a little bit, I won't say anything, okay? And you won't say anything if I snooze off for a little bit either, hopefully. Okay, so we are nearing the point where we have all the grades for the different previous assignments and exams and so on. So we will, if not today, so tomorrow, construct the different groups and post them on Moodle as well. But it'll take a little while for us, so hopefully today, but certainly tomorrow, I hope this will be fixed. But check Moodle for information about this. Yes, that said, we are going to embark on a number of lectures, 3 lectures concerning the technical stuff that we're going to do. And it's a good idea that I didn't have this lecture yesterday when it was April Fool's, because down here it says 300 slides. Yeah, and that's not a joke. Okay, so it's not as bad as it sounds, because there are plenty of colorful images here and there trying to represent what I'm going to show you. And also, we are not going to go through all of these slides in detail. I think of this more as a work of reference for you to have a look at and see what should I know and where can I work out more information about this. Because you will need to do some studying yourselves as well. These slides will not be enough, but they will be a starting point for you. And hopefully they will be a good starting point for you to at least find more material and more stuff to know of. And for those of you who are not present, well, that is on YouTube, or looking at this later on, because we will, as soon as this is done, we will try to put it up on Moodle as well, the recording of this one. We've had some troubles with the previous recordings, but we are trying to sort that out as well. But we will put this recording up, and the recording itself doesn't show the slides very well. But all the slides, all 300 of them, are available on Moodle as well. So you can fairly easily follow these slides by looking at the PDFs that are available there. So the topic for today is full stack web development. And that's slide number 5, so sorry. I'll have to do it like this. So, and we are going to look at 3 different topics with with a number of subtopics, and I'll just briefly summarize what we're going to do here. We are going to talk a little bit about what I mean with full stack web development. We are going to today work our way through web fundamentals, meaning that we are going to look at HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And we're going to do that in a fairly concise way. We're going to speed through all of these technologies, and you'll have to tomorrow to learn everything. No, not really. But you should be, well, fairly knowledgeable, not an expert in any way, but you should understand what I mean with a tag or an element, CSS classes, the header tag, and so on. Because when we get to the next lecture, we are going to introduce Angular. And Angular is a JavaScript framework which is actually using TypeScript instead of JavaScript, but it's still in the category of JavaScript frameworks. And we are going to go through what that means, what it is, what it contains, and so on. And that means that we are going to work our ways through Angular from our first project to a fairly complicated, or not complicated, but complex example where we will see all the different parts from well, components, services. We are going to look at dependency injection. We are going to look at routing and a lot of other stuff as well. We'll go through the basics of Angular in approximately one lecture. With all of these, I will, at the end of each section, I will point at resources where you can learn more about the different things if you want. And when we're done with Angular as such, we are going to continue with Angular, but we are going to look at our backend, which is going to be Firebase. And this means that we are going to use a pre-existing backend available for us, so we don't need to put up any servers, we don't need to configure any databases or anything like that, but we are going to use it. And we're going to use it in our project, and we are going to use it through Firebase. Therefore, we need to have a general understanding on how Firebase works. Okay? And that's what that last lecture will be about. And I say this as this will be Web Fundamentals, the first lecture, and then we will have Angular the second lecture and Firebase the third lecture, but we'll see. We will have these 3 lectures to work through all of the stuff that we've got. So that's basically the idea, and if we don't have time to pull everything through, you have the slides, and if we do, well, then you have your slides, and you still need to look at different things around on the internet as well. All right. That said, it's a lot of stuff, but it's really fun to do. Okay. So I discovered Angular a few years ago, and they have progressed rapidly, and it's really a fun way of doing stuff, I think. It's very object-oriented, which should suit us well, as we come from Java previously. TypeScript, which is the language of choice when it comes to Angular, is also very much more like Java than JavaScript is. Okay? And Firebase is fun because we will have the opportunity to use a real backend service with a lot of services like authentication, like databases, like hosting and storage and so on. So we can do quite a lot, and in the end your end application will be uploaded and hosted on Firebase, meaning that you will actually get a proper URL to which we can go in order to visit this application. And that's quite fun, I'd say. It feels very much like we are creating a real project. Okay, so let's begin. Full stack web development. So the problem with the web is, when we compare it to normal programming, that is the desktop programming, is that it's actually quite a lot of technologies that are supposed to work together. And getting these to work together can be a real pain in the, okay? And they don't really work the same way either. So to be really great at styling things with CSS, for example, you need to have a specific mindset to get everything structured well In HTML, you need another way of thinking, and JavaScript is just JavaScript. And getting all of this working together, and then also together with something in the back end, means that we have many different layers with sub-layers in between them. So we need to understand the front end, which are these web technologies, like, for example, or including HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And we also need to know how to connect these front end thingies to the back end. And the back end itself is there needs to be some sort of server over there. There might be databases. There are different types of databases. We need to get the data from the database to the front end and so on. So front end and back end working together, and that's the full web stack technology. And we are going to make a little shortcut by using Firebase as a predefined backend with server technologies, making it fairly easy for us to create or just use the backend. However, as we don't have full control of the backend, we need to work as they intend us to work. There's a little less flexibility than if we owned the backend. So there's quite a lot of technologies that we need to make to work together. And to be a full web stack developer means to be working on all these layers. And there are examples of these layers from the old LAMP, which was Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP, to more recent things like Mean, Mongo, Express, Angular, Node, I think, and so on. So predefined web stacks, complete web stacks. But as with many technologies, we can pick and choose the way we want to do it. So we are, as I said, going to use Angular as our main client-side framework, which is going to connect to Firebase as our backend. And I did a little picture. And it's not much, I know, and it's not complicated, but it took me ages to do, so you'll have to look at it, okay? So basically, client-side stuff over here. We have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. In our case, we will add Angular on top of this. This is the internet, and yes, that's an image that I've borrowed from the internet. And over here we have a server or multiple servers or whatnot. In our case, we don't know. So there will be a bunch of stuff on the server side, an application server, there will be the database, as you see over there, and a host of other services available in different places. Firebase is large and distributed, and it's built on top of the Google Cloud infrastructure. So there are numerous servers out in the world, everywhere, and we don't really know exactly where our stuff is going to be put. And it might well be put in different places and so on. But we will mainly concentrate on the client side and what we can do there. But before we can get to the Angular stuff, we need to have an understanding of how the web works. All right. And as we're going to use Angular and we're going to use predefined services, we are more or less using a serverless approach. So someone else's server, I basically said this. Yeah, oops. So going on to web fundamentals, which is the part where we need to put a lot of effort today in order to understand the rest of the lectures. So in the end result when it comes to the web will always be HTML, CSS and JavaScript. We don't have to use those exact technologies from the ground up. We don't have to create HTML, CSS and JavaScript ourselves. But the end result must be in these technologies. And that's because that's what the web browser in the end understands. When it comes to Angular, for example, we can create that, and we will be using TypeScript. We could be using, I think it's Sass instead of CSS, for example. And we will use a templating system which looks a lot like HTML to create the looks for it as well. But Angular will transpile, which is basically compile this into HTML, CSS and JavaScript for the web browser to understand. So the technologies are dependent on the browser. And nowadays, this isn't that much of a problem. But as I say down here, 10, 15 years, definitely 15 years ago, you didn't want to have all the functionality in the web browser, the behavior in the web browser, because you couldn't trust the web browser itself. They behaved differently. They implemented very different parts of various standards, in the beginning at least, and so on. And you couldn't always depend on JavaScript being on, for example. And that's basically 20 years ago. But the shift has been that we are now much more able to rely on the web browser, and the web browser is implementing the standards more or less at least the same way. And in addition to that, these larger frameworks, like for example Angular, will help in etching out the little differences that are still there. So we will not be it will not be that difficult. So as long as we can rely on everything working more or less the same on the web browser side, it's a good idea for us now to push out as much stuff as possible to the client. And doing so will also free up resources on the server side, which is a good idea. Because that means that we can use our server-side resources to scale up the application rather than handling the logic that could be done by the individual machines. So the absolute foundation of the web is HTML, hypertext markup language, and from the beginning it's just like any other markup language, namely it introduces something, in this case little tags, to give some sort of structural semantics to a piece of text. Okay? So in this case it's for example the size of text, or color of a background, or a bunch of other things. This was kind of popular way back when, and for example we used it when I was first learning of computers. We had printers, and we used in our documents these little markups in order to say that this should be printed in bold, or this should be italics, and this should be underlined, and so on. And all the different printers had different sets of markup in order to do this. So it was something that was fairly popular to do in these days. So in the end, an HTML file is just a text file with plain text. Late 80s, early 90s, we all know Tim Berners-Lee and some other guy, which we don't know, and we don't pretend to know how to pronounce his last name either. They laid the foundation for this in a paper, late 90s, and all of this was done at CERN, this organization for nuclear research, French-Swiss border. And by Christmas 1990, they had everything working for a web, HTTP, a server, HTML, and a web browser. And of course, it wasn't as advanced as it is today. And from there, we have progressed. We've had several different versions of HTML. We've had several different versions of everything else, and not the least the underlying protocol for transporting the information, so the hypertext transfer protocol, which is now up at version 2, which is the first major version change since 97. So we've been living with 1.1 for a considerable amount of time. And the idea with HTTP2 is to create faster, better packaging of data, making it faster, basically. And on Firebase, they will be hosting by using HTTP2. Fun fact, lnu.se does not yet use HTTP2, so it's a slow site. But most modern web browsers and web servers, application servers, do support this now. We'll stride on by looking at the definition of HTML and HTML5. I found these font awesome fonts, so you'll have to excuse a lot of little funny things in the text. It's not that fun all the time to create 300 slides. You have to put in little things to make your life happier, like that, and the nice drawing of the internet you saw before. From the beginning, HTML was a SGML application, and SGML being a standardized markup language. However, with version 5 of HTML, they dropped everything that had to do with SGML. So it's now it's completely free from that old stuff. The standard version of HTML is now HTML5, even though there might be additions to it. That is what we're going to look at, and we will see and discuss everything as if it is HTML5, nothing else. There are a bunch of stuff all the time being worked upon for new features, new ways of doing things, especially when it comes to CSS, because that's not done yet. HTML is also somewhat evolving, but not as much perhaps as CSS. But when in doubt, can I use it? .com, can I use .com, I should say, is a great place to just, you get the opportunity, just as in Google, just to search on something, and it will tell you on most of the web browsers today how many of them and how much they actually work with that specific thing, whatever it might be. It might be a CSS rule, it might be an HTML tag, or something else. So that's a nice place to go to in order to see if stuff is working. And this is the beginning of an HTML document, and as I said, HTML will always be a text file, and it will contain a number of tags or elements, as they are really called, with opening and closing brackets, and well, it will look like this, something like this. We'll go through these shortly and very fast. But basically, we have a doc type stating that this is an HTML application. So this is something that's basically left from SGML, but we need to define that this is an HTML document. Will the web page be shown as it should in a web browser if we remove this line? Yeah, it will, because the duty of the web browser is always to try to show the web page the way it was intended, no matter if the developer has made errors in it or not. So yeah, it will work nicely without this line as well. But don't take it away, okay? HTML, to define that this is where the HTML document starts. We have a head, which is basically meta information about the document. Over here we can see things like name, content type, and a title, for example. We don't need to put a lot of stuff in this. Meta information like the author, and that's me, D tag, Dan Tobias Andersson Gidlund. It's quite... So I usually spray that in the bicycle tunnels and stuff like that. So if you see that, it's me. Yeah. Well, it's 20 minutes to 9 in the morning. I'm so tired. We don't need most of this stuff. However, in the head is also where JavaScript and styles can be applied, or at least defined where we can find them. So, therefore, the head is fairly important. And the body down here is where we put the main bulk of our application or page. And this is what's going to be shown in the web browser. In this case, we just have a simple hello world. And we see that we mark up whatever we have with something with a name like head and some slash and the same name in order to end that part. These can contain other tags, elements, and these elements can have, as we can see over here, attributes, and the attributes have values. Okay, and it's not more than that actually. After that, it's basically to understand how to use these, where to be able to use them, and what they do, and so on. So, nice beginning. Most of them end. As you see down here, I haven't ended the P tag. It's not a must, but it should be ended. And again, I do this because I want to point out that the web browser will do everything it can to print out this hello world, no matter if I'm sloppy or not. The following slides now will basically say the things that I've already said. So, head for meta information, and also for links to CSS and JavaScript and so on, and we'll see more about that later on. And I should also say that we are not going to do a lot of these things on our own, so to say, because most of this stuff will be handled by Angular later on. But you need to know of these things. And in the body, we have what we see on the web page. And as I said, we are going to work with HTML5, and that means that this body tag doesn't really have a lot of attributes. Previously, and if you find old documentation on web programming, you will see that you can find things like BG color and link and so on for the body tag, but we should really use CSS styling instead. So even though they're still possible to use, you shouldn't use them. What we use are mainly things to refer to rules, classes, identifiers, and so on of CSS styles. And if we look at how to construct the document itself, the main bulk of the web page, we have a number of different groups of elements. So text and paragraphs, as we saw the P tag, links. This is hypertext, so one of the fundamental things to do in a web page is to link to somewhere else. Images, because an image says more than 1,000 words, unless I've drawn them. Tables, because things are nice to put in tables. Lists, because not everything belongs in a table. We want bullet lists as well. And lastly, which is something that we're going to use a lot later on, forms. Forms is the fundamental way of creating the ability to have interaction with the user. So in forms we have stuff like text areas, input areas, buttons, list boxes, and drop-down lists, and so on. So all the different GUI elements that we are used to when it comes to, for example, Java or just looking at the user interface and so on. So that stuff is down in forms. We will just look very fast at it here, and then we will move on and revisit it later on when we get to Angular. In the beginning, the web was all about text. So therefore, there are a number of tags for marking text as headings, sections, paragraphs, or bold or italic, and so on. Ways to make the text look the way we want to. But again, most of the styling we will defer to a CSS style later on. But we want to mark out something. We want to mark something as something we want to put an emphasis on, for example. How that emphasis will look, we can put in the CSS style, but we want to mark it at something. And the same goes for the section. We have these headers, H1, H2, H3, and so on, which are levels of headings for a web page. The style of them we will look at later on in CSS, but it makes it possible for us to give the document a structure. And that's what's important. So basically think the same way as you do with word processing, or preferably LaTeX working, namely that you divide your page into things with headings, with subheadings, with, as you will see later on, nav, article, or footer, header, and so on. So try to define them like that. And this is a larger example. Oof, I forgot to remove. This is the old doc type, and that's why we don't use HTML4 anymore. So skip everything after HTML over there. It will work exactly the same, but don't. Down here in body, we have an H1 for header 1. And in this we have a paragraph, and in this paragraph we have something with bold, says a team, blah 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 blah, and H2, and another paragraph, and we see that I'm sloppy and I'm not ending the paragraphs, but it will work out something like this anyway. So nice header. We see that this one is a little bit smaller, which is how it works out of the box, so to say. Later on we will style this so that it looks a lot nicer than it does right now. As I said, links is something important. They are basically a connection from a web resource to something else. Most often another web page, but it could be an image, could be a movie, could be whatever. And this is what separates HTML from just being a document. And we use the A tag to say that this is an anchor, and then we use most often the href to reference something, like for example, in this case, a separate URL. It doesn't have to be a complete URL. It can be a relative path to some other document that we have on our web page as well. And we're going to work a lot more with this later on as well. Notice that we create the start. We have the attribute href, which takes the exact whatever we want to for our resource, and then it ends with a /a, and this text, Wikipedia here, will be the link itself, and by standard it will be underlined and blue, I think. But it's even more fun with images, so we can include images as well. In this case, we use the image tag, we add source as the attribute, and then again the exact way, exact place where we find this image. So in this case, it's a relative path, so it's in the same folder as everything else. And also, please include this alt attribute. So alt is alternate. So alternate text. So if for some reason the image cannot be loaded, for example, that part will at least be shown. So we can say this is an image of Satine. And also, if you are not able to see it because you are blind and you have a screen reader, this is the text that is read. So do that. Add the alt for all images. Tables are used to structure data in a tabular fashion. So if you have some information that you would like to put in in a table. For example, you have made a lot of measurements for something and you want to show the results. Well, then go ahead and use a table to create that. However, we are not using tables in order to create the layout of the page. So the layout of the page will be done using CSS instead. And if we catch any one of you trying to create the layout using tables, instead of using CSS, we will do horrible things to you, and your children, and your grandchildren, and anyone else you know. As this is going up on YouTube, no, that was not a real threat. Or was it? No, it's too early in the morning. Of course not. But we cannot in any way recommend that you use tables, and we will at least give you an F. But when you do use tables, it's called table, and you can put a lot of captions and so on. But most importantly, we have the table row, and we have table data, which marks up where we have a specific row and where we have data that will be put into to specific cells in the table. And this is basically what it looks like. This is a fairly complicated table. Most of the time we don't need that complicated tables, and if we do, there are also tools available on the web to help us create tables that are looking nice. And lists are for listing things, either by little bullet points or by enumerating them, or by creating definition lists. And they all use ULOLDL, and then to begin the list, and then they use LI for list item in order to define the item itself. So this is an unordered list, UL, starting here, ending over there, and each of the things that we want to put in our list is preceded by an LI and should be ended by a /LI like this, and then we get something like this. So the members of the Jedi Council 19 years before the Battle of Yavin. And there will be a test, so remember them. He's my favorite. He looks like me in the morning. So does he. And he. And he. Yeah. Some of them do not look like me at all. Like Yoda. Except the ears, perhaps. Yeah, moving on. Lastly, forms. Forms are for creating the ability to enter data and send it to the web server. That was the main idea. So creating a form that looks something like a written form. However, later we've taken this a bit further and created a lot of different elements that are available in forms, and also creating new by the old ones and so on. So today a lot of different elements are available for us to use in forms. We can process this either client side, which we will do a lot in Angular, or which is common for other frameworks, namely to send them away to the server, and the server working on the information and doing something with it. We have text boxes, checkbox, radio, file for sending files, submitting text area, and so on. So a lot of stuff. And I'll just show a short example where we have a form method, a form tag with a specific method, post, so we'll send something away, and a name. We will use and introduce a number of other different attributes when it comes later on to Angular, but basically this is how it works. We have an input tag here where we ask for a name, and then we can select race, human or non-human, with a select, so basically a drop-down list. And then we also have a button which we use in order to send the information away. In this case, we don't do anything with the data. So when we press the button, the page will just reload and nothing more will happen. So I can put your name, and I can choose human, except 9 in the morning perhaps, and then press send information, and it will not send it, but rather just reload the page. However, later on, we will continue to work with this and actually do things with this. Okay, so there's a lot more to know about HTML5 itself. So you get some links over here. Also, there's something called YouTube, which has videos of other things than kittens. And there's also Google, which is a search engine where you can search things other than cute cats. So do that, use those. Go through some sort of tutorial I would recommend, and then use YouTube and Google and so on to find more information. You don't have to use Google or YouTube. You can choose any other means of finding, like DuckDuckGo, or could find on other places in YouTube as well. However, Stack Overflow is always your friend. And with that, we are taking 15-minute break. 15-minute break. And we're back. And I'm back with coffee. So hopefully this hour will proceed better than the first one. And I intend to make some short pauses here and there to drink my coffee. Great. All right, moving on. And I know that this is a fairly fast-paced introduction to web technologies, but hopefully you will get enough in order to make it feasible for you to complete the course. Okay, so next step is styling. So when they created HTML, they in the beginning also added a lot of stuff that had to do with creating the outer looks of things. And they did, and I did in the beginning, use tables in order to create layouts and stuff like that. But they saw that this is, in the long term, a bad idea. And the reason for that is that you want to, as much as possible, separate the presentation and the styling and the logic from each other, so that you can work with them in different teams, for example. That might be the case previously. Or, which is also very important, you don't want to mix the stuff because you get very complex web pages, for example. So split things out in different parts. And then we add style. For example, we are going to look at CSS. And the idea is that we use CSS in an external file, and we load that file into HTML, and we can use the different rules that are available in that CSS file. There's a bit of cheating going on because you can put the style, if you like, in a inline in the head as well, and unfortunately I'm going to show you a bit of that. However, things get better as we progress. Everything needs to boil down to CSS. Just as everything needs to be HTML, everything needs to be CSS. However, again, there are alternatives, like for example less and sass, that introduces new features to CSS, adds new stuff to it, but in the end we need to transpile this into CSS, and that's done for us by transpilers. More about that later on. The use of styles has long been tied to the maturity of the browser, because different browsers have been different, have had different levels of following the standard, and the standards have not been ready and so on. And yeah, that's something that I already said. This also has to do with the first version being from 96, the second from 98, and the third being under development. So while HTML5 is actually done, CSS3 isn't. So it's a moving target. It has loads of stuff done, and it's also modular, meaning that instead of being one large monolith that needs to be implemented, it has different parts or modules that might be implemented, and also where the standard has been set or not. So some parts, everything is done, there is a standard. Some parts are very much under development. And then also we have the web browsers. Some of them are very well, implement this, all of this, and some not. But we'll talk about that when we will first begin by just looking a little bit at what we call CSS2, which is something that all the browsers work with all the time. So every browser should work with this. And basically CSS consists of a number of rules. So we define a a look, for example, for something, and we call this a rule. And this rule has three parts. A selector, which tells us which element or which name this rule has. One or several properties that defines the looks of it, and then values for these properties. So basically something like this, and here's an example. H1, you remember H1 for heading 1. Nice little curly brackets, color, :blue. Or we could have something more, the P tag, font family, sans serif, semicolon, color red, semicolon, text align center, like this. And you should not put them as one line as I've done over here, but you get the idea, and you will see better things later on. When we do it like this, we create them for specific already existing tags like H1 and P, meaning that whenever we use that, they will have this specific looks. In order to put these looks or these rules to other tags and to many tags sometimes, we have the possibility to create what's called IDs and classes. And IDs basically means that we give this rule a name, warning, with the number sign preceding it. And this means that when we use, we add the ID warning to some piece of HTML, it will be colored red, be bold, and use small caps. And in this case, we use the span tag, which means that this is for something in a piece of text in a row. Not a block, but rather a row, a piece of text. And we add this ID to this span. Span in itself does not show anything. So it needs to be connected to a ID or a class, as we'll see later on, like this. And then this warning over there will be created in red, bold, and small caps. We'll shown in that. And ID can only be used, this specific ID warning can only be used once on a web page. But let's say that we want several warnings or something else that we want to show several places. Well, then we create a class instead. And they work basically the same, but we precede them with a little dot or a period mark instead. And then we say that my large font in this case should have a font size that's 450% and be blue. And we can use that either with a span, or as we'll see later on, a div, or directly to an H1. And the fun thing here is that we say here that this H1 should use the class my large font. So it will be 500 and it will be blue. But previously, we might also have said that it should be blue or red or something else. And this CSS stands for cascading style sheets. And the idea here is that we can cascade, we can put different rules on top of each other. Meaning that we are going to use my large font, but previously we've also defined H1 to be something else. Perhaps even better if we were put it in pink or whatever previously. So we add style to a to something, an element, and we can add by separating these with just a space. We can add many different styles, and where they overlap, the last added style takes precedence. And in modern web browsers, there are these developer tools. Use them because they can show you exactly from where this, in this case H1, has inherited all its different rules. Yes?
Do you recommend us to use classes? Is this right?
Yeah. So most often you will probably create classes. Yeah.
What about Bootstrap? Can we use it instead?
Yes. And I will talk briefly about that later on. There are, just as you said, a number of different add-ons or frameworks or libraries available that create a number of these classes predefined. The most well-known is, as you said, Bootstrap. And Bootstrap comes with a bunch of different cool classes which we can use right off. And it's quite okay to use that in the project and so on. When we get to Angular and you create an Angular project, I would, however, recommend that you add Bootstrap, or, as I might recommend, Material Design, which is another of these, to your project as a Angular module, rather than using the plain old way of doing it. But we'll get to that later on. And there are additions. I would also recommend you looking at, for example, PrimeNG, which has a bunch of cool components really that are available, just as Material and Bootstrap has. So we are showing, I'm going to show fairly ugly things, but we want you to create beautiful things. And if you, like me, cannot draw a circle without it looking like, yeah, something you can't say on YouTube, then please, by all means, use these Material or Bootstrap or PrimeNG and so on. Pseudo classes are for adding effects to specific selectors, like hover on the anchor tag, meaning that whenever we hover over a link, in this case, we will change the color of the text itself and the background. So it's a way to add additional effects to something inside of something else, like an A. And as I said, we should preferably create our style sheets, as they are called, our CSS files, as files, specific files, that we put outside of the HTML, and then in the head we use something like this: link, style sheet, type, text, CSS, and then an href to the specific file itself, because we shouldn't put everything in the HTML file. Okay, so do that. Try to really use external style sheets like this. Div and span, because when we want to create things like, for example, layouts, we need to be able to talk to a block of code. Span, as I said previously, applies just to a line of text, for example. However, span takes a complete block. And together with creating margins and stuff like that, we have a basic way of creating a layout. Later on, we are going to look a little bit on flexbox and grid, which are more specific ways of creating layouts. And then whatever way we intend to do it, we need this div tag in order to say that this block of code does something specific for us. And a block is something that contains other elements, other tags, basically. So here I have a example CSS file, and I put it in a file called thestyle.css. And it's basically all the stuff that we've already seen. P with some additional properties. Font 80%. See that we can just say that we wanted 80% Georgia, and if Georgia is not available, use serif. Font size 12 points. Margin left, so we want this to begin 12 pixels from the left in. So Hoover, warning, my large font, and a box, which is basically what we want to use our div tag for. And in this case, that is a ID, so we can only have one. Warning is also an ID, whereas my large font is a class, and the others are for already existing elements. And the box down here has a 2-pixel solid black border, and everything inside of it is line through. And we use this like this. It should really be inside of the head, but it doesn't matter. But we link to our style sheet, and in our body we say this is a span ID warning, and everything inside of this will then be red small caps. Here is an H1 with my large font, and here's an H1 without. And it will then fall back on the previously defined H1. And here's a link, and here we have the div, and we can see that the div begins over there and ends over there. So this is a block because it contains a number of other elements. BRs, H1, and a P. And if we look at this, it will look something like this. Sorry? No, it's ugly. Yeah, I know. It's ugly as sin. Most important, perhaps, is that we have down here a box or a div tag. So it's a block of code. And everything inside of this will have this line through. This is very large, not so large. This is a warning. See that it goes in a bit because it's a P tag as well, and so on. Okay, and that's basically how this works. A few more things that might be of interest in order to create layouts and other things that are not styling the text itself, because mainly what we did previously was to style the text itself. However, as I said, we can use CSS in order to spice up how everything looks apart from that. So one of these things that we can do is to modify the positioning of whatever we want to put on the web page. So for example, we can put things in front of, left, right, button, or top of anything else. And in CSS, as it is right now, we have 3 different methods of doing this, either saying that things are fixed, relative, or absolute. Fixed is, as it says, we give it a position, which means that it can overlap other elements, and it's there. Really nice if we want to create a toolbar, for example, or something like that. Relative is relative to its normal position, and absolute, and the difference between the relative and absolute is that over here we reserve the space, so the space where it would have been will still be there, it will be taken. However, with absolute we position it relative to its first parent without still reserving the information. And overlapping is on Z level. So 3 boxes, 1, 2, 3. The first one is fixed, solid black. The second one is relative, blue. And the third one is purple and absolute. And when we run this, yeah, sure, we need some text. The first one is a fixed toolbar, ID 1. ID 2, will be 20 pixels to the left on where it should be, because we said so. Here's a text about Dracula. Yeah. And here, number 3, always here, absolute positioning, where the Mars text begins. So here's some text about Mars. Yeah, so it looks something like this. This is the easiest one. It's just over there. And it will continue being there. This one is 20 pixels where it should be, so it's still retaining the place. If we put it down here, it would still retain its space. And this one should have been easier to understand if we didn't have the BRs, because then we would see that it would actually overlap. And if we scroll down, we see that this is still over there, and this one is still here, but perhaps not the best example, but this fixed one is kind of cool because it stays on top of it all. And the last thing about the CSS2, I think, is about the floating layout. So basically we need to be able to put things beside each other, and we can do that by using float. So float left means that it will float up and put things to the left of itself. And that makes it possible for us not to put pictures on top of each other, but rather to have them next to each other instead. And we use this small picture. We can do that small picture like that. Or we could have created a div saying that everything inside of this div should actually be using the small picture, which has a float left. This should be indented, of course. I don't know why it looks like this, with a specific width, height, and margin. And then we get something like this. These are the members of Pink Floyd. And there will be a test. He's called some guy. No, now you've done it, because here's an anecdote. There was once a little girl. No, there was a woman a few years ago. She was out with her camera. She was out taking shots, and she saw this guy at the beach walking his dog. So she snapped this guy and put it on her Instagram saying random guy with dog. And then everyone said, well, it's David Gilmour from Pink Floyd. True story. Yeah, so that's David Gilmour, Roger Waters, Nick Mason, Richard Wright, and Syd Barrett. There will be a test. CSS3, however, is not as ready as CSS2, but by now it's really, really far in. Many of the things that I'm going to show you down here are done. It's fixed. You can use it. If you're unsure, go to this caniuse.com and check it. But most of the things work out of the box by now. As I said, modularized, so about 40 modules, and much of the idea with CSS3 was to be able to create something that made it possible to create web pages without Flash. And that's a good idea. Yeah, exactly. So we don't want Flash. And many of the things are actually quite nice. Okay, and in order for this to work, especially previously when so much wasn't implemented, they introduced something called vendor-specific prefixes, meaning that we could introduce these rules into our code, but prefix them with, for example, WebKit or Moz or O or MS or Chrome or whatever we wanted. Okay, so we could prefix it and say that use this for this specific web browser, use this for this specific web browser. And that might, that might sound like a bad idea because it will clutter up everything. However, the alternative, as we did before CSS3, was to include loads of JavaScript checking the web browser. Is this Microsoft Explorer? Do this. Is it Firefox? Do this. Is it Chrome? Do this, and so on, in JavaScript code. And that's not a good idea. So therefore, they introduced vendor-specific prefixes instead. And as I said, most of the things that I'm going to show you today, it works out of the box, so we don't need them. But I haven't updated all the slides, so. We'll look at layouts, a little bit of transition and transformation and web fonts, and I think from there on you will be able to go on. And as I said previously, we have and we are still able to create beautiful user interfaces by creating a lot of divs and saying we want a margin over here, we want a padding over there, we want everything to move around like this, and so on. And if you go to stuff like the CSS Garden and so on, you'll find templates that are absolutely amazing. However, there have been two additions to try to make the layouts more flexible. First one is Flexbox, or easier to use. That's basically grid. And also that they are more, they are better prepared for different screen sizes than previously. So Flexbox is called Flexbox because it flexes. So it's easier to create responsive design and so on, basically. However, I usually end up in a mess when I do that. And we have grid, which makes it also a little bit easier, at least, to create better layouts. And I will not go into details about this, but basically Flexbox works by having containers containing different items, and you add rules for how these items in these containers are going to flex, how they are going to change depending on, for example, screen size or whatever it might be. You define a parent with display flex, so display flex activates Flexbox, and then you can define direction, wrap, justify alignment, and so on. And you can there's some shorthands as well for doing this. And for the specific items, child rules, we have that we put in these containers. We can have many containers, and in these we can have many children, and then we put a lot of rules on the children itself, like the order of them, how they should grow or shrink, and so on. And that means that we can define that, well, this is an area, the container, and inside of this I want everything to flow like this, or I want it to stand still and move, or whatever it might be. And this is just some short example where we create a container with this display flex. We align everything center, justify it center, create a height and border, and then for every item we put it at max width 50. And if we look over here, we use the class container, and flex item, it should say class equals to flex item over there, and not just flex item. And when we do this, we get everything in the middle like this. Or we can create a container using a class which we'll define as nav, main, and an aside like this. So the idea here is to clutter up HTML as little as possible. We just create a few div classes, And we're going to create a three column layout where we say that the container should be flex and everything should be in a row, so after each other. Nav should have a minimum width of 300 pixels and should not grow. Main should have a width of 20 EM, which is another measurement which is based on the size of the font being used instead of a fixed size. It should have a little bit of padding to the left and right, and this one should be able to grow. And then an aside which is 300 pixel and not growing. And we still don't have a poster or a trailer for the upcoming Star Wars movie, so you'll have to make do with Han Solo movie, which wasn't as bad as everyone says, because it's a Star Wars movie. Idea here is that we have something to the left, and we have the middle, and we have something to the right. And it's fairly easy to set up as compared to when doing it with the old-fashioned way. And lately, the grid layout system has also been approved and is implemented in most browsers. And well, it basically works by creating things in a grid. And it's a little bit less perhaps flexible than Flexbox, but a lot easier to use. You use display grid or grid inline, and then you basically create the number of columns or cells that you'd like to use. The idea is basically the same as previously. Container over here, display grid. We have template for the columns. We put them to auto, and 10 pixel gap between them. And for all the different things that we have inside, in this case we have a nav, main, and an aside. We only need to put which column this will be. And the end result will be exactly the same as previously, which is still really nice. Transitions is for making transitions on different on the different rules that are available in CSS. And for example, when hovering over something, and over here we see that in this case we want a transition on the A element. So whenever we hover over an A element, we want a transition on the background for 0.5 seconds with ease, meaning that it will smoothly change the background from from 9C3 to 690. So it will create an animated effect when we hover over a transition over an A tag, and it will change the color of the background of it. And we saw over here that we use Moz, in this case for the Firefox browser. We could do the same with Chrome or WebKit or whatever. Today, as it says here, we don't need the prefix because all the major browsers, even the ones for mobile, support this. Yeah, you can read up on that. The important thing is that if we do want one of these rules that we are unsure if they work, we can also make shorthands. So if we want the previous example to work on Moz, WebKit, and Opera, we can do it like this, namely putting everything background 0.5 and ease like this. And there are a bunch of more things that we can do with these, and there's a nice list, properties over there, and you'll find a lot more information about this on the web as well. Over here I have an example of creating a nice looking menu with CSS3 and a lot of CSS2. I won't go through that one. I'll show you just the basics over here, and that's most of the time this is how you create a nice menu on top of somewhere. You create an unordered list, and each of the list elements will be parts of your menu. And if we don't want them to have this little bullet or being beside each other, we can remove the text decoration, bullet signs, underlining the bullet sign, put them float right instead so they will be beside each other, and put some transparency. It will look really good. Some text shadow, just for making them looking good. And yeah, some more color. Some border radius, making corners look, yeah, now you've done it. The door closed. Making the corners rounded. And then some transition. If you put everything of this in, you will get something like this. A menu where you, when you hover over a item, a slightly dimmer version box with rounded corners will show up animated during 0.3 seconds. It's really nice, and it's really something that you could add as an effect. And here's the entire CSS. Transformation works the same way, namely that we put transformation on a rule. We got these guys again. Let's see, over here. The transformation in this case, and here's a more complex looking CSS rule, which says that if we have an UL for gallery, each of the list items, when they have a hover over that link, the image will have a transformation. And this transformation scales it 0.5% larger than it was before. And that's all we need in order to scale something. So with this rule, whenever we hover over an image that has these properties, it will pop out and be larger. But we can also add a transition to that, so it doesn't just pop up, but rather animate slowly towards us, or slowly, 0.2 seconds. That's fast. And then we have these guys again. And when we put the mouse pointer on top of them, they will expand, and you'll see we have a nice little drop shadow and so on. And they will expand in 0.2 seconds in a little animation. And this, I'd say, is one of the reasons for using CSS3, namely that we can do stuff like this without using Flash and so on. And if you use libraries like, for example, Bootstrap, you will get a lot of this for free, or material, or whatever you choose to use. You get this for free, but it's still a good idea to understand how it works beneath. Lastly, web fonts. We don't need to use the boring typefaces that come with, well, that are standard, so to say, that are available on all different computers. But we can rather create, or rather we can use typefaces that we put together as either a woof file, yeah, or a true typeface, open type, or SVG for special occasions. So we can add the web font to the directory or the folder where we put all the other stuff, so that we know that, well, this specific typeface is available for this web page. And we use the font face in CSS3 in order to do this. And this is also an example of putting things in 3 columns, and you'll have to look through that a little bit. This is basically just for creating 3 columns. 3 columns with a width and a gap and a rule, which is just a line between them. But we also add, in this case, I have a WOOF file, Optima regular with font face. I define that, and I also I give it a name, Optima regular, and I give this font face heading, which is Gothic Ultra, which is an OTF. And then I say that the P tag should be Optima regular and the H1 should be using heading, and then it looks something like this, and it's very beautiful. Okay, loads of stuff. You can learn more. We haven't looked at JavaScript just yet, so we'll have to do that the next lecture, and then move on to Angular as well. As always, W3 Schools and Mozilla has loads of things to teach you. CSS Tricks is a really nice place. HTML dog, poof. Sass and less are other pre-processes which can be used instead of using CSS. You can read up on them too, but get a basic understanding of CSS. That's the most important thing. And then we will look more about a lot of other stuff the next time, because it's now almost 10 o'clock. Question or no? That was not a question. No. All right. Thanks, everyone. See you tomorrow.